I mean, I may have to retool my definitions after Salvia divinorum, but what has always worked up until this year was to say what interests me are indole hallucinogens, this very small chemical family which are LSD, psilocybin, DMT, ibogaine, and the beta-carbolines. Small chemical family. And we can argue about this. Just recently I saw a wonderful quote. Now, who was it? It was either Goethe or Nietzsche, I can't remember, but the quote was, "Thinking is better than knowing, but seeing is best of all." And I thought that was very good support for my own bias in favor of hallucinations. People say I have a fetish for hallucinations. And in a sense I do, because to me it's the sine qua non of what psychedelic exploration is about. Those of you who are sophisticated in these realms know that, for instance, LSD, what it really does is it makes your mind race. It makes you think thousands and thousands of thoughts. But it takes rather a lot of LSD to push you over into outright, overt visual hallucination. I mean, oh, hi, Paul. I thought it was God. It's just James B. Warner as God. You managed to throw me clear off the trail, dude. Anybody have a clue what I was talking about?
You were talking about LSD.
Oh, LSD and how it doesn't really cause hallucinations, right. It causes walking wallpaper and stuff like that. But what I'm talking about, and this is worth talking about because it's hard to put this across to people, and a lot of people who think they know what psychedelics are about don't realize what we're striving for here. What we're striving for is overt, highly colored, stable, three-dimensional hallucinations of things previously unimaginable. That's the last clause is the kicker. In other words, not just the garbage of the surrealist imagination, pink elephants, giant bread knives, and the detritus of the 20th century, but things previously unimaginable. Because in confrontation with things previously unimaginable, one cannot help but be propelled to the conclusion that this is not me. How could it be you? It's weirder than anything you could possibly imagine. If that's part of the self, then the self requires a rather more expanded definition. We thought the self meant that which is most familiar and known to me, not the self, that which is utterly unimaginable, completely alien, and potentially utterly terrifying. That doesn't sound like the self. Yeah.
Well, would you say that the psychedelic realm is like an equivalent to our century as the New World was to the 14th century Europe? Or?
Well, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, literally, we've landed in new territory.
Is as big as the New World was to the Europeans?
It's not only as big, it may be as concrete. In other words, with all this talk about virtual reality, with all this talk about empowering the imagination, with all this talk of wandering off into the simulations of the computer-assisted mind, then we can't really tell, is it going to become where we live? Is it going to become no more intense than great art? Or is it going to spill over and become reality itself? I think this is probably what we're talking about, that what we have discovered here is the source of our own creativity. We've discovered, that in the same way that the primeval ocean is mirrored in our blood, the primeval ocean of creativity pours through the hyperdimensional labyrinth of the human mind. I mean, what is so impressive about these plants is in a burst of an hour's worth of hallucination, you have the impression that you're seeing more art than has been created in the last 30,000 years. You, Joe, anybody, have this stuff flowing through your head at some enormously compressed data rate. And trying to get a grip on this is literally like trying to empty Niagara Falls into a thimble. I mean, you know, you come back and you cannot communicate it, indicate it, do anything about it, and yet you've been to the mountain. Yeah.
Well, how would you get some psilocybin and take it, and how would you do it specifically? What would you recommend?
Well, in the case of psilocybin, I think it should just be grown. That if you have a yen for the alchemical calling, this is it. I mean, you can take an $18 100-pound sack of rye and turn it into $25,000 and still have enough psilocybin left over to send you and your entire neighborhood straight over the edge. So, you know, the formula is rye to mold, mold to gold. And cultivating the mushroom will teach you a whole lot of things that you may need when you go voyaging. Punctuality, cleanliness, attention to detail, persistence, calmness of mind, all these very middle-class virtues which it requires from you as cultivator will later serve you very well as navigator. And you have a complete assurance of the purity of your product because you grew it on a human food that you bought down at the organic co-op. And it's alive, and it's active. And you aren't supporting criminal pyramids of criminal activity. You aren't honking up white powders of unknown origin, so forth and so on. This is really the responsible way to do it. You can also go to foreign countries and collect these things in the case of mushrooms, and you can collect them in the United States in some localities. Those of you who are fortunate enough to be Europeans, and for more than one reason, but one is that there are mushrooms from Hamburg to Vienna and from Marseille to Moscow. A lot of them. So, yes. Yeah.
Years ago, when LSD was more in the news, I recall these kinds of observations that when a musician would just be extemporizing, we'll say, during the process, this person would imagine himself never playing as creative, in that sense, with that degree of creativity as ever before. A recording is made, and when he's not under the influence of LSD, he's saying, "Oh, that was so good."
So you're saying it distorts
the
judgment?
The truthfulness of those kinds of observations that were made then, that when you're under the influence, it sounds as though you're truly creator. But when you're not under the influence and have listened to a recording, you say, that's not so hot, isn't it? That's
right. So you want me to comment on that?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, it is true, you know. I can't remember the guy's name, but there was a no-hitter pitched under the influence of LSD. Does anybody know the guy's name? Anyway, it was an epic moment in the history of baseball, and incontrovertibly so. Yeah, well, I agree. Part of life is learning how to tell shit from shinola, stoned or unstoned. And God knows the New Age is afloat in some of the most lightly anchored speculations the world has ever known. I think I have said previously, if it works, use it. I think the contrapositive is, if it doesn't work, don't use it. Pot is a good example. Some people are just worthless on it. they're the people who give it a bad reputation because their eyelids hang, their jaw hangs, and they become rather like the furniture. Other people, are able to perform on it. I would like to see psychedelics studied scientifically for their impact on creativity. Give it to people in situations where they don't know what they're being given and how much. Some of you probably know Os Yanniger in Los Angeles, a psychoanalyst with long interest in LSD. And he has a collection of paintings, before and afters, or rather before and durings, on LSD. And some of them are quite striking, the transformation, and some of them are not. It transforms seeing, but you're quite right. Any idea, whether it's born in the height of psychedelic ecstasy or Himalayan meditation or in a crap game in a boat off Jamaica, it has to be measured against all other ideas for its validity. And I think that psychedelics promote connectivity, and that many of the connections promoted are trivial, silly, and irrelevant. But so many connections are promoted that inevitably some are interesting and serviceable. So essentially what we're saying here is that psychedelics are a mutagenic influence on ideology, but then those mutations must submit to the process of natural selection that chooses serviceable mutation from mutation which is simply lethal or irrelevant. Yeah.
Are psychedelics illegal in other countries, Europe, Russia, Asia? And if not, why do you think they haven't been studied there?
Well, it's a complicated question. There is something called the International Convention on Narcotics, which you don't get to join the UN unless you sign this thing. And it basically commits you to a program of drug oppression fairly similar to what we have in this country. In Europe recently, there has been some lightening up on research and also public use and attitudes. Europeans just don't seem to be quite as hysterical and constipated about this as Americans. But these psychedelics, it's very interesting. I mean, look at what's going on. In the American drug laws, we have this category called Schedule 1. Now, the definition of Schedule 1 is no medical use whatsoever, high degree of addiction potential. Cocaine is not Schedule 1 because cocaine has use in certain eye and throat operations. And so the stricture no medical use whatsoever doesn't apply to cocaine. What you get in Schedule 1 is heroin and, astonishingly, cannabis. My God, the most harmless and maligned of all human intoxicants ever encountered. It's there. And then the psychedelics, which as international drug industries amount to nothing. I mean, the psilocybin industry is not creating gangster warlords anywhere on the planet, as far as I know. And neither is the DMT industry, and neither is the ibogaine trade, and neither is the peyote trade, so forth and so on. Yet these substances are furiously stigmatized. Well, it's because they cast into doubt the very most fundamental assumptions of the society. What these things are, ultimately, is deconditioning agents. They cause you to question the premises you were told never to question. And so it doesn't, and democracies, totalitarian states, socialist states, fascist states, they can all agree on one thing. Their citizens shouldn't question first premises. The word of the party or the founding fathers or the maximum leader or whoever's running the show is not to be challenged. And psychedelics erode faith in social mythology. And therefore, they are very, very controversial and difficult for a society to handle. And I don't know if they can ever be made legal. Only a truly confident and healthy society can legalize psychedelics. And I don't have to tell you that American society at the end of the 20th century hardly fits the description competent, confident, and sure of itself. So no, these things are absolute taboos. You know, our sexual taboos we have more or less overcome, or at least there's a lot of yak about how we've overcome them. But this is definitely over the edge in this society. Yeah.
Yes, what might be expected, if any, interaction between the new psychopharmacological drugs, especially the antidepressants and other drugs?
Oh, this is a
with,
fascinating question.
Psilocybin or LSD, and also how similar are people's experiences to the extent that they can be verbalized, afterwards. And is ecstasy one of these drugs?
Ecstasy is MDMA. It's sort of on the edge of the category. It's what some people call an empathogen, meaning that it causes people to have empathy. It isn't a spectacular hallucinogen. As to your question about how similar are people's experiences, well, because this is not being done in a scientific manner, but rather by a persecuted underclass, there's a lot of variables. If people would eat the same things and take the same doses in the same circumstances, their experiences would be rather more similar. But people take these things under all kinds of circumstances. People take all kinds of other drugs, antidepressants, alcohol, vitamins, this, that, and the other. Their system is loaded. People come from various backgrounds. One person's parents are Irish immigrants, somebody else's parents are Swiss diplomats. You have all this to work with, but out of all that comes the conclusion, I think, that yes, people are talking about generally the same thing. It's almost like the situation when the New World began to be explored. For the first 100 years, all you had was the notebooks of explorers. And you couldn't tell whether Explorer A was talking about the same river system as Explorer something else until you put all these accounts together. The question about the antidepressants is an interesting one because it leads in several different directions. Since World War II, there's been this belief in corporate pharmacology that you could basically medicate unhappiness with drugs. And a series of all kinds of, many drugs have been produced to do this, ranging from Miltown through Halcium, Valium, so forth and so on. All these drugs have produced various addictive syndromes and have toxic side effects. This new family of antidepressants, Prozac and its relatives, are interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, they are pointed toward the serotonergic system, the same system that all these psychedelics act upon. For example, the way psilocybin works is that it competes with serotonin for what is called the bond site or the receptor site. And psilocybin has a greater affinity for the bond site in the human synapse than human serotonin does. It's almost as though you pictured these psilocybin molecules elbowing the little serotonin molecules out of the way and taking their place at the head of the line. And then the higher cortical readout of this is what we call the psilocybin trip. Well, now, what is Prozac doing? Something different but related. Normally, when the nerve fires, serotonin floods the synaptic cleft, the little interstices between the two nerve endings, or where one complexes to the next. serotonin normally floods that junction when the nerve fires, and then a few milliseconds later, it's reuptaken, is the technical term, or uptaken again. If you take Prozac, the reuptake of the serotonin is blocked, and what you get is a synaptic cleft juicy with serotonin. It isn't pulled back for the next firing. And this has an extraordinary impact on human mood, attitude, approach to life, so forth and so on. And I think it means we have probably crossed some kind of frontier into the realm of designer states of consciousness that are going to be very challenging to straight people, and even somewhat challenging to people like myself who are enthusiasts for plants and kick-ass, roll out the barrel kind of experiences, because Prozac isn't that. It's very subtle, freakishly subtle, and yet incredibly powerful in what it does. And, it spawns the debate, is it good to be in designer states of consciousness all the time? But it only spawns this debate among the naive, because through propaganda and cultural programming and so forth, the real self, whatever it is buried so deep under so many levels of social programming that tossing in a few milligrams of Prozac, for crying out loud, isn't going to make any difference. This is scary to some people because they believe that there is something intrinsically good about suffering. And I think we should all wonder. What I find fascinating about Prozac is that it doesn't do all these good things for you forever. It slowly becomes more like being it slowly becomes true that it is more like being on Prozac if you're off it than you're on it. And that's very interesting, A drug that is self-canceling. A drug that leads to the conclusion, I don't want to take this. We haven't seen that before either. Yeah.
I think it's similar to the dopamine, like the Wellbutrin, the tests that were done with, the L-dopa. It seems to trail off after a certain amount of time and self-defeating.
Yeah, which is very interesting. A drug with a half-life, you could almost say, that eventually becomes utterly uninteresting, even to the most devoted fan. But, drugs are here to stay. Pharmacology is here to stay for as long as we are. And educating ourselves about these things, they are like clothing. We clothe the body. That practice began a long time ago, and there were probably traditionalists who said that it wasn't natural and hid the true self, which it did, but that didn't halt the Yves Saint Laurents of 60,000 years ago from rolling forward. And similarly, now we clothe the mind.
I have a question about, and this is what I've heard. Basically, a good example that was given to me about when tripping is that this is sort of like your brain, and it comes out like this to, this is just an example, it's not quite literal. And normally when the trip is over, your brain goes back this way or this way. But now there's some people whose brains can't fit back in, and they just end up tripping for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, well, it's the holy grail of some of us and the great fear of others. Excessive use.
We're like, this might be a little bit more apt to worry about that a little bit more than others.
You mean, who among us are the squirrels?
No, but that's another thing I think that should be kept in mind if that's true.
No, it is true. It should be talked about. This is the question, what about the well-known phenomenon of the psychedelic casualty? You know, the poor wretch shivering in the doorway with an incomprehensible sign and a kitty on a piece of rope who wants your attention. You know, what about that? Well, in my experience, this is usually a case of multiple drug abuse. I don't understand people. I mean, I guess nothing can be assumed. Everything should be said. The way you don't do this is to become a drug, an indiscriminate substance user. Like some people write articles about how, well, what we need is a new drug and here's what it should do. And other people synergize things. People just go on benders, you know. They say, well, we did a little ketamine and then somebody brought out the DMT and we chased it with ether and you say, you know, and then you say, how was it? They say, far out. Well, good Lord, of course. What you're trying to do here, if you're conscientious and you want to survive to tell your grandchildren how great it was, what you want to do is develop a relationship to substances that are feeding back positively into your growth process, and then push them to the limits. You know, we don't need more drugs, more kinds of drugs. There's nowhere we want to go that we can't get on what is available. And so what it's a matter of is learning to navigate and manipulate certain substances. And this is how shamans do it. Shamans tend to concentrate on one substance or another. Of course, usually these are not highly mobile cultures, so maybe there only is one or two options in the local area. But you want to try and find, in the Castaneda phrase, your ally, a plant that you can work with. For instance, there are all kinds of, as I said earlier, bizarre states of mind accessible through plants. For example, the whole Datura family. Systems of magic are based on this. Shamanic systems are based on it. And people in contemporary society intoxicate themselves on these things. But you don't hear me talk about it much, simply because for me it seems dangerous, out of control, threatening, dark, not useful. And then, you know, LSD, that's a slightly different thing. You don't hear me talking about the white light or dissolving into unitary states of higher consciousness with Sanskrit names, because that doesn't interest me either. What I'm interested in is this teeming dimension of hallucinogenic hypnagogia that is just one quantum tunnel away in the visual cortex. And I see that it's not God, that it doesn't have the unitary hierophanous qualities of God. I don't know what it is. I mean, you know, what if Columbus had expected God when he got to Cuba, and not finding him had said, well, then piss on this, we're going back to Spain. You know, you don't get what you want, you get what is waiting for you at the end of the trail. And I go as an ingenue, as an explorer, as someone who, I say to it every time, show me, teach me, show more. And it's never what you expect it to be. That's the great thing about it. It is not predictable. I don't think it gives aid and comfort to Hindu metaphysics or Tarahumara mythology or any of the rest of this. I mean, it doesn't dump on these things, but it introduces you to something larger still, bigger yet. It was the novelist John Crowley who observed, the further in you go, the bigger it gets. And this is certainly true. It's a paradox, but most truths are.
I read a reference to some compounds called JB compounds, JB and the numbers, I haven't been able to find much information on them. What was described was very visual. Do you know anything about JB?
I can't speak to this with certainty, but that's a lab number designation that doesn't refer to structure. Was it in Hoffer and Osmond's hallucinogens?
No, it was actually on a tape of Ram Dass describing something he took at Millbrook.
Right,
Very visual.
JB 130, this kind of thing. These were experimental drugs coming out of the government, and the people getting them had no idea what they were. It is now probably in the literature what they were. They were probably STP relatives of this kind of thing. There are a lot of hallucinogenic compounds on the shelf that no human being has ever tried, but that theories, physical theories, steric theories of hallucinogenesis suggest these compounds are probably highly active. It's quite a thing to take a hallucinogen no human being has ever taken. I mean, you talk about... There was a question over here? Yes.
When you're ready to shift subject, would you care to comment on current events, politics, economics, how what's happening currently fits in or doesn't fit in with your fundamental millenarian theories and so forth?
Well, we'll get into a bit of this evening, because we'll look at the time wave and talk about historical compression and that kind of thing. If you're a rationalist and a reductionist and an existentialist, then I think the present situation must be pretty hair-raising, because it looks like we're just going to sail off into complete scarcity, fascism, regimentation, and then finally extinction. It seems very hard to see how we could pull out of the power dive that Western civilization has become. I am none of those things, rationalist, reductionist, so forth and so on. I believe that there is a director to the show, and that we are moving toward a revelation of some sort, and that these religions that anticipate a revelation are in fact correct. They just got 99% of the details bollocksed up. I mean, it's not going to support their weird notion of a laundry list of moral do's and don'ts and a God on a hunt for vengeance. That's not what it's about. But I do think history is ending. Linear time is ending. And that information, which used this monkey as a vehicle, as a stepping stone to some higher order of being, that the information and the monkey are on the brink of recognizing each other and possibly parting company. In terms of day-to-day stuff like Bosnia and Sarajevo and all that, what McLuhan said would happen is happening. He said the consequences of electronic civilization would be fragmentation. The nation state is a fiction in the light of the electronic understanding, and so it's dissolving away. I mean, nations are now exist and function at the pleasure of disembodied entities called corporations, for whom capital, not land, is the reality. And these corporations are like cults. And if you want to get in one, and then it will take care of you to the grave, and your children and your children's children. The collapse of Marxism revealed, I think, that the struggle between Marxism and capitalism was in fact a diversion, and that the real ideological struggle that will decide whether the earth lives or dies is not a struggle between Marxism and capitalism, but a struggle between capitalism and conservationism, or ecological consciousness, or values that do not place the values of the market in the first position. It's a matter of some frustration to me that feminists, psychedelicists, conservationists do not make common cause, because all of these positions are responses to the same misapplied official culture. And so I'm hoping that psychedelics can maybe be a bridge, because psychedelics promotes awareness of the planetary agenda, which correctly understood is a feminist agenda. And, we can talk, recently these things have been drifting in this direction. We can talk about things we could do that would change the world. Mostly what we should do are acts of not doing. We should not consume, we should not hate, we should not kill, we should not watch. Watching is a very sadomasochistic and perverse thing. Whether you're watching TV or whether you're watching your government struggle in quicksand and do nothing about it. Watching is a sick activity. In terms of what we need to do, we need to find strategies for increasing the feminine expression of the race, and we need to limit population growth. If we don't limit population growth, all do-gooder liberal schemes for making things less horrifying are doomed, because all social gains are simply gobbled up in an ever-expanding population. And yet, there has not yet begun to be a mature debate about this in the body politic. I believe that every woman should have only one child, and that women in the high-tech industrial democracies are particularly under the moral implication to do this, because children born in the high-tech industrial democracies use between 800 and 1,000 times more resources than children born in the third world. So if we limit population in the first world, it will have a much more rapid and visible impact on environmental destruction and resource depletion than if we preach it in the first world. The political dialogue has matured to the point now where we understand that the feminine has been suppressed, that it needs to be brought into balance with the masculine, but we haven't yet understood, we have tended to demonize masculinity. And so social programs for dealing with this problem have tended to stress feminizing men. This is a stupid idea. Men can't be feminized, obviously. What we need to do is have fewer of them around. I think that the 50-50 sexual ratio is an artifact of dominator culture that is a way of forcing monogamous pair bonding, and that the true natural ratio between the sexes is probably more like 70-30 women to men. And that if we had a situation where through taxes, insurance, and this sort of thing, we encouraged women to have only one child, and then we further encouraged women that these children be 70% female, within 40 years, the Earth's population would be cut in half, and there would be 35% more females in the population. We would begin to see the light at the end of the tunnel. We would begin to see things pull back into balance. And don't misunderstand me, it's not that there is anything wrong with masculinity. It's that we have the capacity for expressing masculine social values and feminine social values. And the long march through history put a great premium on being able to bash out your neighbor's brains and take and hold territory. That was all very fine. It doesn't apply in the 20th century. We now need feminizing of our social values, and rather than turn men into some kind of distorted image of women, let's honor men and simply have more women in the social matrix for as long as it takes, a few hundred years. It's our population and our society. We can dial these ratios up and down through insurance policy and tax policy and so forth and so on. Very simple. Of course, I'm not really keen for all of this because I think the Earth is going to disappear into the unspeakable in about 18 years. But I don't think that idea is permission for not thinking about these things. I think we should act as though we are responsible. And then as conditions change and new data arrives, we can fine-tune our response. But you never hear this kind of discussion. I mean, the most radical lesbian feminist yak I've never heard anybody suggest that we limit the number of men in the population. And yet, obviously, that would do it quite nicely without a lot of breast beating and raving and ranting about the matter. Horrified silence. Yes?
You mentioned, I believe it's in the Archaic Revival, you discuss a concept that I find very interesting, which is that the mushrooms might actually be is a possibility. There might be an alien intelligence that is here to work symbiotically with the human mind and to bring us to where we are now, theoretically, or maybe perhaps not where we are now, but where we should have been by now.
Well, I'm a very sort of plodding and rational thinker. And that stage of my thinking, the mushroom as extraterrestrial, and I don't deny it to this day, but it had to do with dealing in a rational way with the question, who's talking? Who is talking? Because I don't know if I've mentioned this specifically, but when you take mushrooms, one of the unique things about psilocybin is that it speaks. It not only shows you hallucinations as other compounds do, but it speaks in English to you, addressing your concerns. And this is very well attested to, well known. It's part of the literature. Well, and this is really what drew me into this, because in the 60s, I was like every college kid into LSD and so forth. But I had this friend who kept saying, it talks to you. And I just thought, this was the ravings of a diseased intellect. I could not conceive of what that statement meant. It talks to you. The plant talks to you. Well, then when I finally got to mushrooms, I discovered that it's so, and it contravenes points of your room late at night on an empty stomach. You've just eaten a plate of champignon, and now you're having a dialogue with a disincarnate entity that claims perfect knowledge of the last 100 million years of galactic history and wants to chat about it with you. Well, so here are the possibilities. It's either an entity in another dimension, which notice that that's a black box explanation. We don't know what another dimension is, but another dimension. Or it's yourself, or it's an extraterrestrial. And then there is some other possibilities, like it might be human beings in the future or something like that. Well, then let's look at the most obvious explanation that the rationalist will lunge for. It's yourself. It has to be yourself. Well, then, I mentioned this earlier, then how come you can't recognize it? If it's yourself, how come it seems to be the weirdest thing you've ever encountered or imagined? That somewhat twists the definition of the self. And so then I began thinking, well, extraterrestrial. Let's try to fairly assess this without prejudging it. Let's look at the mushroom. Let's look at fungi generally. What are they? They're what are called primary decomposers. That means that mushrooms are the only form of life that lives only on dead matter. The dietary habits of mushrooms make the dietary habits of the Dalai Lama look like an orgy of slaughter, because the mushroom eats only dead matter. It is a karmaless diet. If you were a Buddha designing yourself for life in this universe, you would become a fungus. No blame. No blame. Next thing, the mushroom reproduces in two ways: vegetatively, which is of no interest here particularly, and through a kind of sexual reproduction that involves the production of spores. Well, a spore, if you analyze it, is a biological unit perfectly designed to survive the most extreme physical conditions in the universe: the cold of deep space, high vacuum. A single Stropharia cubensis mushroom in the sporulation phase is shedding about 3 million spores a minute. It can do this for 3 weeks. One mushroom. This gives you a notion of how many of these spores there are. And the outer surface of spores is the most electron-dense organic material known in nature. It's as electron-dense as a metal. And what this means is that as these spores percolate through the atmosphere, they can get charges of static electricity on their surface that make them repellent, electrically repellent to incoming radiation and particles. In other words, they can almost form a force field around themselves. So what we have here is a very non-invasive life form with a reproductive strategy that allows it to cross space, with DNA such that when it's unfolded inside a mammalian nervous system, the thing can communicate. So what it looked like to me was it looked like a piece of sophisticated engineering. It's not an organism quite as much as it's a machine. It's a nanotechnological machine that is self-replicating, that drifts for eons through space, and that when it finally finds itself in a suitable environment, it can produce this fruiting body, the carpophore, and then interact with the ecology into which it's been inserted. Now, this, to somebody who's never taken psilocybin, this sounds like an incredibly tormented explanation for what happens when you eat mushrooms. But to someone who is familiar with these places, this seems utterly reasonable and quite consistent with the facts of the matter. I've lost interest in the question because after 25 years of living with these ideas, I've completely convinced myself that the most predictable revolution yet to come in biology, so predictable that it's ho-hum, is that you will be reading in a few years that scientists now believe spores and viruses can survive the environment in outer space, and that it's impossible to search for the origin of life in this universe because life has been percolating between the stars for upwards of 1 billion years. Fred Hoyle had the idea that various flus and viruses actually are swept in here on cometary debris.
Panspermia.
Yeah, the panspermia theory. It has come to me to be seen to be a kind of academic question. What is incontrovertible, and what you can assure yourself of by the simple act of taking 5 grams of mushrooms in silent darkness on an empty stomach, is that there is an alien intelligence interpenetrating the human experience. And I've thought about it, those 1950s science fiction movies where when the saucers come, they land on the south lawn of the White House and all that. It won't happen that way because that's very invasive. It will be subtle. It will insinuate itself into our mental environment, and we will be familiar with it before we even know what it is. And if you think about it that way, then imagine a nearly omnipotent alien intelligence contemplating the Earth and considering the possibility of a contact with its most advanced primates. You would say, well, now how can we do this without alarming them or skewing their historical development? How can we do this? I said, they're very rigid, they're very linear, they're very categorical. However, they have one sphere of activity where they traditionally abandon their categories. Say, oh, what is that? Zongonk 3. It is the domain of intoxication. These creatures do not demand that the contents of their intoxication mesh with their physics and their science. What I mean here is, if I tell you that I sit in the Esalen bar and drink white wine and see pink elephants, you do not begin an epistemic investigation of the category elephant. You just dismiss me as a drunk. Now, if aliens wanted to go unnoticed, they would certainly succeed by disguising themselves as pink elephants. And I think that's what we have here. Possibly. We have an alien disguised as a shamanic ally. We have a force that is at work on the Earth. Because, think about shamanism this way. What do shamans do? They cure disease, they predict weather, they predict game movement, and they resolve social conflict through supernatural knowledge. And what I mean by that is they seem to know who's sleeping with who stole the chicken, so forth and so on. They seem to know stuff other people don't know. Well, if you analyze these abilities, weather prediction, game movement, curing, and unusual knowledge about social circumstances, the path to achieve all of these goals is simply hyperdimensional understanding. You know, if you could rise one dimension up, next week would be perfectly transparent to you. The weather of next week, the game of next week, and who will be alive and who will be dead next week, which is a useful thing when it comes to choosing patients to treat, you see. So a shaman is someone who has gained extra-dimensional knowledge through a symbiotic relationship with a plant. And shamans will tell you this. They say, you know, the plants tell us these things. So it's almost as though the information is deployed in a higher topological matrix, and we can explore these matrices and avail ourselves of this knowledge. But you have to make your way into it with shamanic techniques, almost techniques of conjuration, because you're not moving in a domain of science. You're moving in a domain of archetypal magical energy, where things have to be propitiated and placated and riddles solved and tasks completed and that sort of thing. It has more the dynamic of Jungian fairyland or the alchemical quest or something like that.
Do you have that little list of questions?
Yeah, I do, right here. Let me take a look at it. Well, this is a question of a high-end dose of psilocybin is 40 to 60 milligrams. And the question is, this would seem to be more than the heroic dose of 5 grams that you have suggested. Is the ego flattening that you talk about the same as the ego death that Leary talks about, or something else? I think that this just stems from, I don't know what, miscopying of manuscripts or something. Very few people have ever taken 60 milligrams of psilocybin. That would be a pretty horrific thing to do. I know someone who did. I won't say their name, but it was of the original Leary circle, and it's quite frightening. What seems to happen with these higher and higher doses of psilocybin is that this alien world just becomes more and more real. And you know, on DMT, you can tolerate the reality of the DMT flash because it only lasts 2 to 5 minutes. But I think if it lasted any longer than that, you would begin to clench, because the real assurance is at least you know this isn't going to last very long. But it gets more and more real, more and more convincing of its placeness, until finally, you know, it overwhelms your last resistance to the idea that it's another world. And at that point, like a hero in an H.P. Lovecraft novel, you've become hopelessly mad. And then hopefully, you know, not a few minutes later. But in that one instant, when the utter reality of it is incontrovertible, you've really parted company from the rest of us.
Have you ever used Pagam Harmala as an admixture?
With DMT, you mean, or with mushrooms?
Or with mushrooms, or either.
No, people use Pagam and Harmala as an MAO inhibitor to boost mushrooms, but I had an experience years ago where I took half a dose of mushrooms and half a dose of ayahuasca, and it scared the socks off me. I mean, if you do this in an experimental fashion over and over again, there will be hard evenings. And that was one of the hardest I ever put in. And I'll tell you what happened. I hope never to see this particular stretch of psychic territory again. But I took half a dose of mushrooms and half a dose of ayahuasca, and 2 hours into it, I began to get anxious, like very anxious. And it would take the form of this sense that something was wrong. And so then I would search the environment and my body for, you know, something's wrong. What's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And then the answer would come back, nothing is wrong. And I would absorb this news. And then 10 seconds later, I would become overwhelmed by anxiety again. What's wrong? What's wrong? And I analyzed it. And I realized what was happening was that short-term RNA transcription of memory had become jammed somehow. And I knew who I was, I knew my history and my life story, but I had no memory of the previous 2 minutes. That's all. But I found that really alarming, panic-inducing, actually. And I had this image in my mind. Remember the scene in 2001 where the computer lures the guy outside the spaceship, and then when he goes back to it and he says, open the pod doors, Hal, and says, I can't do that, Dave. So, open the pod doors, Hal. I'm unable to do that, Dave. And I could almost, in my mind's eye, see this piece of enzymatic machinery at the molecular level. I could see that it had locked and grabbed, and that we weren't going anywhere till we got this puppy broken loose. And I was very disturbed. And I just sat there and I said, you know, I'm not going to get up, and I'm not going to say anything, and I'm just going to sit here until this thing lets go. And I could see, literally, I could see the receptor, and I could see how somehow this enzyme system wasn't working right. It was not carrying the drug away from the synaptic cleft the way I wanted it to. And I just watched and watched, and it was like watching spring come over a Rocky Mountain lake. Eventually, the ice melted, and it cracked and broke, and then I felt it begin to flush away. It was just like, oh man, you know, maybe it's time to find honest work. Because the great fear, you know, I mean, I do not fear death in these places, because I think the only way death can come upon you in a psychedelic state if you're an ordinary healthy person, not if you have a coronary thrombosis on the way. But the only way death can come upon you in these states is if you choose it, you know. And if you choose it, that's your business. But what is the real worry for anybody who's honest about all this is madness. Madness is a more difficult to assess possibility. And it is true, I think there are very few people who are being warehoused in a ward somewhere because they took a psychedelic drug 30 years ago and they're still sitting there in the stance. I hope there's nobody on this planet in that situation. But the issue for white guys like me, and then for everybody else to lesser degrees, is this issue of surrender. You know, when the psychedelic compound begins to flood the synapses, the ego freaks completely. Because for the ego, this approaches with the force of a tsunami. And it says, it flashes a message, which is, you are going to die. You are going to die because you did this. And at that point, this is where you get to test your mettle. At that point, you just have to turn to it and say, no, you are going to die. But I'm not going to die. But you are going to be swept away and dissolved, and compose yourself for it and get ready, because it's too late to stop it now. And then, you know, the ego, whimpering, will take its place and sit down and shut up and just wait for the wave to hit. But it doesn't like it. And I find it doesn't get easier to do these psychedelics. It's like a membrane. It's like jumping into ice-cold water. You don't want to do it. Once you know, I mean, not the little trips, not the buzzes and the horsing around, but when you know that you're going to take a trip that's going to put the pedal to the metal. We even used to have a rule, which was, if you don't think you have taken too much, you haven't taken enough. In other words, you should take an amount such that it's very hard for you to be cheerful as you sit there waiting for it to come on. Because you know that it's building out there beyond the horizon, the energies are gathering, and that when this storm moves ashore, your sails will be bent to the wind. And it's great, you know. It's the last frontier, and you ride these things through, and you learn something. You know, you learn something about yourself. You don't have to climb Mount Whitney to put yourself to the test. I mean, these are the real places, and the real gold is out there. Yeah.
I'm interested in how your brother's doing. And, are you planning to go back to Columbia and take up with what you left off with?
Well, this question, I presume, comes out of a reading of True Hallucinations. Those of you who haven't read it, it's a sort of a brother bonding story about our journey to the Amazon 20 years ago and our most intense encounter with the cosmic giggle. An encounter so intense that basically I'm still spieling off it. I haven't had to have my gas tank refilled since March of '71. Dennis is a molecular chemist, neurologist, drug designer, and he works for Aveda Corporation in Minneapolis. People imagine that there's a great difference between our points of view on these things. There really isn't. I mean, his approach is more scientific than mine. But I think he would agree with me that the effects that we were able to unleash at La Chorrera don't fit into any orthodox paradigm of how these drugs work and what is possible. See, what was really at stake here is understanding mind, what it is. And we don't know what mind is. An example that I like, or a metaphor that I like, is for 2,000 years, electricity was what you saw when you rubbed a cat's fur with an amber rod in a dark room. That was electricity for 2,000 years, and people knew that you could do this. Rub an amber rod across fur and light would shoot off of it. And then people learned how to light cities, how to smelt steel, how to transfer information at the speed of light with the same energy that was trickling through the cat fur in the darkness. Psychedelics and the mind are like that. We haven't yet figured out what to do with it, but I'm convinced you can do anything with mind. You know, this is the domain that builds starships. This is the domain that travels in time. This is the domain that creates immortality. This is the domain that fuses the species into a single entity. The imagination, taken seriously as a force, will transform the human world beyond recognition, I think. Yeah.
I don't mean to change the subject forcefully, but I've come here to really hear a little bit more of what it does to the mind rather than psychedelics themselves. Are you going to talk about
You mean what it does to the mind?
I mean what you talked about, what is mind? That's really the question that I'd like to hear. I mean, the other things seem to be very technical and very interesting to many people, but...
Lead me deeper into this.
Okay.
You mean you want to, your hope was to understand mind as...
No, I wanted to hear more of what your mind has to say to us, rather than...
About the experience?
Yes, not about while you're in it, but what it brings up. I'd like to understand, I mean, reading your book or hearing you on your tapes is such a rich thing, and to me talking about psychedelics isn't. But
Isn't it the same thing?
Exactly.
Well, if I can see the hoop, I will jump through it. So let me see if I can see it.
Did I not make myself clear? Maybe I didn't. I just meant to say, I didn't realize this was going to be a workshop on how to use these drugs. I wanted to hear what you have experienced and bring it into our consciousness. I've never done drugs, so I may be an odd one out here, but...
Well, yes, I see what you're saying. This evening will be basically a pretty theoretical recitation of my conclusions about this. I feel like on these weekends there has to be a certain amount of time given over to these triviata, simply because this is how people can find their way there by themselves. I really don't want to found a cult or even a movement. I'm much more interested in empowering people to go to these places themselves, because I really think that all mind is the same. That, you know, some, like Ram Dass tried to convince me that I was special. And I said to him, you know, but if I'm special, my career is pointless. Because the point of my career is that you don't have to be special to do these things. That this belongs to Joe anybody. It belongs to every man and woman on the planet. The conclusion, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about the psychedelic conclusions. The conclusion that I reach is that it's no accident that in the 20th century these things have been rediscovered as part of this fascination with the archaic, because I really think that we're going to need psychedelics in order to understand what is about to happen to us, because the world of ordinary experience is going to become psychedelic through technology. You know, technology is like a psychedelic experience happening in three-dimensional space. So we're caught. Well, it's a funny dilemma because it's hard to talk about it without just plunging into it, but I wanted to save some of that for this evening. But there's a big mystery that we have overlooked. I talked about this a little bit this morning. There are two things which are absent from our worldview that are making it impossible for us to understand what's happening and position ourselves in reality correctly. The first is the fact that the universe is an engine for generating novelty. That novelty is what it's about. And the reason that's important for us is because we are very novel. Now, science will tell you that human beings are the irrelevant chance witnesses of events in a forgotten corner of the universe that has no rhyme nor reason. Placing novelty at the center of your value system changes the picture completely. Now we have something much more like the medieval universe. We have a universe where human beings are the most important things, objects in the universe, because what we represent is a tremendous concentration of novelty. So this is the first value or perception absent from modern understanding that makes it retro, that it has not recognized the universal tendency to conserve and build on novelty. The second great truth, which has escaped the inspection of the Western mind, is that time is accelerating, that this novelty is being generated at an ever faster rate. So it isn't a steady descent into novelty. It's an ever faster descent into novelty. And that then, if novelty is the thing which anchors human beings at the center of cosmological values, then the acceleration of time is what anchors the present at the center of cosmological values. So then suddenly we have a whole new metaphysic here. What we have is a metaphysic where human beings are very, very important, and the present is very, very important. So this is not an existential universe, a universe devoid of meaning, where you simply confer meaning through opinion upon things. It turns out this is a universe striving toward an end point, and the end point can be perceived to be very near. And so let's suppose, as I will show you this evening, that the universe is a cycle, a series of nested cycles, such that each cycle is 1/64th as long as the cycle which preceded it. Just hypothetically entertain this possibility. So then, now we know, or we are told by our priests and holy men, that the universe is 12 to 15 billion years old. So imagine a cycle of time larger than that by some order of magnitude. Let's say, just to pick a number, a 72 billion year cycle. Now imagine that embedded in that cycle is a cycle 1/64th that duration. That would be a cycle of about 1.2 billion years. Now imagine that embedded in that cycle is a cycle still smaller by a collapse factor of 64. Well now, given that set of presuppositions, how many levels do you think you have to go through to go from 72 billion years down to the domain of time represented by Planck's constant, which is 6.55 times 10 to the minus 23rd erg seconds? How many of these collapses are necessary? I don't expect you to do the math. The answer is 26. But the more interesting question is, how long is the cycle that is halfway between? How long is the cycle that is halfway between 72 billion years and the duration of Planck's constant?
1 second.
Approximately a second and a half. And what does that tell you? It tells you that if there were a universe based on that kind of a system of cyclical involution and collapse, that universe would be halfway through its process of unfoldment 1 second before its end. 1 second before its end. It would be only halfway through its process of unfoldment. In other words, it would go through as much development in the last second of its existence as it went through in the previous 72 billion years preceding that second. This is the kind of universe that we're living in. The Big Bang, which scientists place at the beginning of the universe, is a misapprehension. We're living in the universe of the big surprise. And the big surprise is this trapdoor in reality, where in 1 second you go through half of the developmental history of the cosmos. And it lies ahead of us in time. History is, if we take that 1 second times 64, times 64, times 64, now you've got 5,000 years. History is one of those cycles. It's the one which takes 5,000 years. It's followed by the one which requires 67 years, 104.25 days. That cycle began at 8:25 a.m. on August the 6th, 1945, over the city of Hiroshima. And at the end of that 67-year cycle, there is a 384-day cycle, which will begin late in 2011. And embedded in that cycle is a 6-day cycle. And embedded in that cycle is an hour and 35-minute cycle. And embedded in that cycle is this magical 1 second in which the universe plunges through 13 of these levels of closure in a fraction of a second and implodes itself. Now, highly unlikely, you say? How do we assess the probability of something which only happens once? That's an absurd thing to entertain. Plus, let's look at what the competition is peddling. The competition also has a cosmology. It's called the Big Bang. They claim that for no reason, from a point considerably smaller than the electron, the entire cosmos burst into existence in a single moment. Well, now notice that whatever you think about that, it's the limit case for credulity. Do you understand what I mean? I mean that if you can believe that, my God, what would you balk at? If you can believe that the universe sprang from a single point for no reason instantly, I think there's very little that you would rear back at and say, oh my God, man, that's impossible. And these physicists, this is the tale they tell, however, and then the universe went through a series of very brief epochs, nanoseconds of unfoldment, and then suddenly space-time and energy existed, and we have what's called the era of physics. But before that, for a jiffy, there was the pre-physical era, and about that you're not supposed to ask, or just people look very pained if you bring that up. But this myth of science is absolutely no different and on no more solid ground than the words, "Let there be light." It is, in fact, that myth told from another point of view. Now, what we conclude from looking at this cosmology and from the more radical cosmology that I proposed is that every cosmology gets one singularity. You get one free singularity or you can't even play this game. Well, those guys chose to play their singularity at the first moment of the game. I believe that this makes no sense at all. How could the universe spring from nothing? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm from Missouri. How could the universe spring from nothing? But the universe as we experience it here today is a very complex thing. We have the domain of atomic particles, we have the domain of the hearts of stars, we have organisms, cities, planets, ecologies of all sorts, chemical regimes of great pressure and complexity and energy. We live in a complex universe. And it is out of complexity that singularity will emerge, not out of a featureless plenum. That's not where it will come from. It will come out of complexity. So the story that science tells us, which is that there was a primal cause, and that then, like a line of dominoes, the universe just unfolds according to the laws of nature as these dominoes fall. This isn't what's going on, folks. What's going on is the universe is a process under the control of an attractor. And the attractor does not exist in the past. The attractor exists in the future. Now, scientists shudder at this because this is the bugaboo called teleology, purpose to ordinary folks. Science doesn't like the idea that processes have purpose because that implies God. If you are listening with a 19th century ear, it implies God. But if I release a marble up near the rim of a bowl, and the marble circles around and around the rim of the bowl, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that it's going to come to rest at the bottom of the bowl. Now, we could say the bowl is the attractor for the end state of the marble. And in fact, mathematicians do say this. But it isn't that the purpose of the marble was to rest at the bottom of the bowl. That's a silly way of talking about it. Similarly, history is a process that is under the control of an attractor. It's a chaotic process. And the ascent, the condensation of the galaxies, the emergence of life, the evolution of higher animals, the ascent of consciousness, the march into history, and the establishment of electronic culture are all examples of this deeper and deeper march into temporal complexity. We are part of the universal drama. The fact that we think, feel, fear, love, hate, desire is, in fact, what the pre-scientific mind assumed it was. It is the stirring of ultimate purpose in our souls. I mean, it isn't a guy with a white beard and all that malarkey, but it is a relationship to the whole. The universe is fractal. The microcosm is in the macrocosm, and vice versa. And history is the journey toward this revelation. And when I say history is the shockwave of eschatology, what I mean is that we are the strongest argument there is that something weird is going on this planet. If there were just glaciers and chipmunks and daffodils and elephant herds, no big deal. Chemistry gone nuts. That's what life is. But we represent something else. We represent an epigenetic undertaking, meaning change not under the control of genes, but under the control of language systems, technologies, mythologies, intellectually generated control systems. Our presence on this earth means that the process of novelty condensing into three-dimensional space has reached a new and more critical stage. And the invention and use of the atom bomb meant that yet another frontier had been crossed in this spiraling in toward the confrontation with the transcendental object at the end of time. Because when you arrive in the final moment, you are the thing beheld. The journey toward the unspeakable transforms you into the unspeakable. I mean, this is what theology is all about. This is what religion is trying to say. It's just that it gargles razor blades before it speaks. Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by what you said about the explosion of the first atomic bomb heralding in the 67-year cycle. Is there something about these cycles that what's the relation between the cycles and huge events like that? Is there?
Well, the reason I say the final cycle began over Hiroshima is because each of the final cycles begins with a bang, because the first cycle began with a bang. So what we have here are a series of, God love him, as James Joyce said, we have a series of Viconian thunders here. And the atom bomb bursting over Hiroshima is literally a resonant echo of the primal explosion that created the universe. This is a theory of history that sees it as a field of resonances. This is why I'm so keen on James Joyce, because
LSD was also discovered right about that time.
he was?
LSD.
Oh, LSD, right. Yeah. Yeah. Pardon me?
That your theory, concept, is a linear concept of history, rather than the concept of that, and I've become familiar with it, all is happening at once, that it's which is where how you place psychic phenomena.
Yes, there are three possible views of history. The one you're indicating, which is that it's all of a piece and happening. Then the Hindu notion, which is that it's cyclical but eternally repeating. And then this idea, which is that it's cyclical, but it's what engineers call a damped oscillation. It runs down. You get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter cycles until finally you have cycles so short that for all practical purposes, thinking is a meaningless activity. If the universe is predestined, then you think what you think because you couldn't think anything else. And the premise of thinking is that it is a freely undertaken activity. If thinking is no more free than the orbits of the atoms or the electrons, then the universe cannot reflect upon itself. My theory is kind of a mugwump theory. In other words, I have my mug on one side of the fence and my wump on the other on this predestination issue. I don't say that the future can be predicted. I say that where in the future novelty will be more probable can be predicted. I say that we can abandon probability theory and replace it with a theory of the ebb and flow of novelty that will allow us to predict when novel events will occur, but we will never be able to predict what those novel events are, because that would be predestination and that would make the whole exercise futile. But in principle, I mean, this is part of my lecture this evening, but I might as well just give you this bit, because what we're going to be talking about this evening is time in depth and in detail. And any full exploration of psychedelics leads to confronting these issues, because somehow it is about the process of time. Every culture has a model of time, whether you realize it or not. It's just there in the air you breathe. And the Western model of time is an idea created by the Greeks and then made much more persuasive by Newton. And this is the idea that time is a perfect mathematical surface. Now, what I mean by that is that time is so smooth that no matter how much you magnify it, it always appears perfectly smooth. Medieval science was done with a number of these idealistically perfect objects. The perfect sphere was used to calculate the orbits of the planets until it was discovered that planets don't move in perfect circles. The perfect cube and dodecahedron were also used as mathematical models for nature. As science evolved, one by one, these Greek this impedimentia of Greek idealism was given up and laid aside. It was discovered that the planets move in elliptical orbits, and so forth and so on. The only one of these Greek mathematical objects to survive was this idea that time is a perfectly smooth surface, that it is invariant. And it's easy to see why this idea was preserved. It's because science cannot function without this assumption. Even though this assumption is hellishly difficult to prove, the reason science can't function without this assumption is because science rests on the concept of experiment. And what is an experiment? An experiment is a situation where when you restore what are called initial conditions, then the same thing happens again. You know, you have a ramp and you roll a ball bearing down the ramp. Then you pick up the ball bearing and bring it to the top of the ramp. That's called restoring the initial condition. Now when you let go of the ball bearing, lo and behold, it again rolls down the ramp. Every time you pick up the ball bearing and restore the initial conditions, the ball bearing behaves in this predictable way. Now, something which doesn't behave this way, science says is not an object for scientific discovery or examination. Science requires temporal invariance. It requires it. Why is this? Because for 300 years, science has operated based on what is called probability theory. How does this work? We ask a question of nature. Let's say the question is, how much electricity is flowing through this wire? And we have a measuring device. Here's how probability theory works. We'll take 1,000 measurements of the electricity running through the wire. We will add them together. We will divide by 1,000. Now we say this is how much electricity is flowing through the wire. It's an average. But the strange thing is, when we look back through our 1,000 values, not one of them is necessarily the final value we came up with. We didn't measure the value we are claiming is the true value. It arose out of averaging. Averaging only makes intellectual sense if time is invariant. If time is variable, then you cannot average measurements taken at different times. If time is variable, then an experiment performed on a Wednesday may give different results than an experiment performed on a Saturday. Well, so we could almost say science is the study of those phenomena so crude that they are immune to temporal variability. And what does that leave out? Everything interesting. Love affairs, social revolutions, corporate takeovers, the evolution of society, the creation of works of art. No, just ball bearings running down slopes, electricity running through wires, this sort of thing. So science has become an incredibly powerful tool for describing these lower grade phenomena. But higher grade phenomena, where consciousness or even great complexity is an issue, are completely outside the ven of that kind of prediction. And I think that as we intellectually mature, we're going to have to agree that time is not a perfect Aristotelian object, that in fact time is a fractal surface. And we will talk about this in great detail tonight. It empowers an entirely new way of thinking about nature. It empowers an entirely new way about thinking about predicting the future. It empowers a completely new way of thinking about how the present has been shaped by the past. And it's a psychedelic point of view. It gains its power by anchoring itself in another dimension, another dimension of retrospection, basically. Yes.
Are you going to talk about chaos theory, and can you say a little bit about entropy?
Well, yes, I'm going to talk about all of this. We're just hovering on the edge of it, but it all leads into this, because what I've come away with, I do accept the scientific premise that real theories are mathematically, can be stated in mathematical terms. In other words, if I tell you gentlemen prefer blondes, that is not a theory, that's some kind of an observation. A theory can be expressed mathematically, and tonight we'll look at the mathematical expression of the psychedelic theory of time, because it's very exciting. It secures for us the collective importance of the psychedelic experience, and it also illuminates the human journey through time. I mean, we are in an incredibly exciting position. We are about to go around the bend, a bend that we've been approaching for 25,000 years, each successive generation carrying us closer to the moment when we go around the bend and see a whole new perspective on what it means to be alive, to be human, to be a thinking creature in the cosmos. Yeah.
Earlier in this beginning of the session, the question of paranormal phenomena came up, and
Right.
you said that you could keep us entertained all afternoon with oddball phenomena that have happened to people in the psychedelic subculture.
You mean you would like a story now?
Just a couple
Tidbits.
Just a couple examples of that.
Well, okay. Well, here's a story. For whatever it's worth, this is a story which happened to my brother years and years ago. He and a girlfriend took Hawaiian wood rose up behind Boulder, Colorado, in the early spring. And they had never taken wood rose, and so they parked their car and they hiked down this trail and took the wood rose and became hopelessly lost. And the trip lasted hours longer than they intended. And finally they realized that they were hopelessly lost. It was getting dark, and that they were going to have to spend the night in the mountains at about 10,000 feet behind Boulder, and that they probably weren't going to live through this experience. They had no matches, they had nothing. And so then darkness fell, and they had no notion of where they were. And finally, just scanning these valleys and mountains, my brother saw a set of headlights up on a mountain. And he realized then that there must be a road up there, and that if they could climb up to where he had seen these lights, they might be able to flag somebody down on this road and save their lives. Okay, so by this time they had been out in the woods for about 10 hours going through this. So they scramble down into the bottom of this valley. They scramble up the other side, come up to where they think this road is, and what they discover is the parking lot where they left the car. And what they discover is the car's lights are on. But the car was locked, and the car's lights couldn't have been on for 10 hours because the battery would have completely run down. The car still had enough juice that you could start the engine. So the car's lights had been on no more than a half an hour. Woo, 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 woo. What does it all mean, Mr. Natural? Well, I think Mr. Natural said it don't mean shit. I don't know what it means, but and there are just endless these kinds of stories, and some aren't quite so supernatural, but some are more supernatural.
Let's hear one of them.
Well, here's a story I find very, very hard to believe, but that was told to me by someone of impeccable reputation. This guy was up in the Sierras somewhere on a vision quest, and he had made his camp by a little lake, and he dropped mushrooms and a boloid. Do you all know what a boloid is? It's one of those big green crackling meteors that pass over. A boloid came over about an hour into the trip and disappeared over a nearby hill, and he was just amazed. And the mushrooms were just coming on, and then the trip happened, and he was swept away, and he basically forgot about the boloid. And after a couple of hours of tripping, the mushroom said, "Now it's time to walk." And he said, "Oh, now it's time to walk." It said, "Walk this way." And it directed him, and he walked a distance of about 2 or 3 miles, and finally came to the edge of a lake, and he couldn't walk any further, and so he stopped, and he was just standing there contemplating this circumstance that it had told him to walk, and now he was at the edge of this lake. He was wondering, am I supposed to walk on the water, or what is going on here? And he looked down, and there was the boloid, and it was worth several $1,000s. He has it. He showed it to me, and it was, I mean, it's an object from God knows where. I mean, just absolutely screaming with the cosmic abyss and the karma of the aeon. And if you've ever tried to find meteorites, it is something you cannot look for because they can land anywhere, literally. And this guy found one that weighed over 1 pound, and he wasn't looking for it. He saw it go over, and the mushroom led him to it. Stories like that, which indicate what they indicate to me is that the universe is put together in a way that we don't understand, that it is higher dimensional and we are lower dimensional, and that if you could see the universe from a higher perspective, this man's finding of the meteor was inevitable, trivial, and couldn't have happened any other way. I'll tell you one more story and then I'll stop. This is not a magical story. This is an almost magical story that tells you have to be careful when judging magic. This happened to me, and it relates to the question about fractals and what we'll get into this evening. I was once with a bunch of people in a teaching situation like this at a beach down north of Vandenberg Air Force Base. And there's a huge beach there that runs for miles and miles, and it's very flat and smooth. And I was walking on this beach by myself, and I came upon a little black stone, flat stone, about that big around. And I noticed this because it was all sand and this was the only thing on the beach. And I noticed it, and I kept walking. And after a while, there was another one of these black stones, so similar to the first that though I wasn't holding the first, it seemed to me it was exactly like it. And I thought about this. And I was, I confess, slightly loaded on mushrooms. And so I did something I might not have otherwise done. I counted the number of steps between the first stone and the second stone. In other words, I turned around and I walked back to the first stone, and I counted the steps. It was like 760 steps. Then I walked back to the second stone and continued walking down the beach and counted my steps. And 754 steps later, there was the next black stone. sitting on the beach. Now, what is going on here? Is this omen? Is it magic? What is it? It's none of this. It's that this bay was acting like a huge computer, and it was solving a fractal equation of great complexity, and the solution to the equation was to deposit a round black stone every 760 steps, give or take 8, along this beach. But if you didn't know about fractal mathematics, if you couldn't see nature from this point of view, you would be presented with an enigma, you see. And yet, what is really happening is that nature is inviting you to understand. Nature is taking you by the hand and saying, you know, I'll lift my skirts this tiny, tiny bit. Do you have enough sense to look underneath, to follow it through, to understand? And the psychedelics are very similar. And they bring you into a similar relationship with nature. I mean, here's just a little story. This is not supernatural or of quite the character of the story I just told. But one time I took something, I can't even remember what it was, but it was in Hawaii. And I was sitting on a beach and I was meditating or thinking or something. And a crab came along. And I was sitting so still that the crab cleaned my fingernails for me, every one of them. It just came up to me and worked its way from finger to finger to finger until it was done, and then it went on. Now, you know, that's getting into the Tao, I would like to believe. Well, that's enough of that. 8 o'clock this evening here, we will look at the computer. If you're computer phobic, have an affair and go to the baths. And the rest of you, I'll see you here. Be called the stump speech. That means as you go from Hamlet to Hamlet, you have to repeat the same thing over again because it's supposedly your unique message.
What if you were a preacher?
Well, preachers are supposed to do exegesis of Scripture and choose a different passage each Sunday to work off of. So here's the notion. This is the distillation of my own life involvement with psychedelics. And it's just a style of thinking to try and make sense out of experience. You don't have to try and make sense out of experience, but I have just sought to do that. And in 1971, in a series of encounters that are described in True Hallucinations and further elaborated in The Invisible Landscape, my brother and I in the Amazon seemed to get hold of the main line of gnosis somehow. And what came through is, I suppose, what we have to, in fairness, call a channeling, although I hate that phrase and the crowd it implies. It was an insight. If any of you have read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, you know that this is how breakthroughs occur suddenly and unexpectedly, and often to people in the periphery of a field, not centrally concerned with it. So, I always imagined that psychedelic revelations ran along the line of love one another and kick back, that kind of thing. Instead, what came through was an incredibly precise mathematical revelation about the nature of the structure of time itself. And it is, I suppose, somewhat outlandish for you to listen to me talk about this, but it's not nearly as outlandish as for me to listen to me talk about this, because I know how chosen for this, I am. In other words, I don't care about time or mathematics or any of the rest of this stuff. It's just that it literally seized my attention and compelled me to carry out an intellectual exorcism which involved working with this idea and working with it and working with it until finally I had it nailed, defined, could stride to the blackboard and write the equations. And how many people here have any familiarity at all with the I Ching? How many people here are hearing the words I Ching for the first time? Good, okay. Well, all right. Part of this depends on a certain familiarity with that vocabulary and worldview, because my encounter with the other, it didn't take the form of an enormous completed revelation dropping from on high. Instead, it took the form of a small, still voice in the depths of the psychedelic experience saying, go buy graph paper. In other words, it was a gentle leading to the mystery. And what it was about, and this now depends on some knowledge of the I Ching. As you know, the I Ching is a Chinese divinatory system of great antiquity that utilizes 64 ideogrammatic characters made of broken and unbroken lines called hexagrams. And that by a process of sortilege, either the tossing of coins or the use of yarrow stalks, a hexagram and its change are generated, and this then is thought to be an augury of the situation. Are we all agreed on that? Thus it has been in China since the Han Dynasty. Pretty much unchanged, and there's been a lot of exegetical literature generated, but basically the earliest stratum of Chinese civilization, the I Ching, is already present and intact. And so this question that was posed for me was a very academic one, it seemed at first. It was simply this. The 64 hexagrams occur in a traditional order called the King Wen sequence. And the question was this: is the King Wen sequence a sequence? Or is it in fact a jumble that has become a traditionally accepted order? Now, the difference between a jumble and a sequence is that a set of rules will generate a sequence. A jumble is just a jumble. So in other words, I began to seek the rules for the King Wen sequence. And obscure, right? I mean, sineological obscuranta. However, there is something interesting about it, because this King Wen sequence is the oldest known example of a human abstraction. We possess shoulder scapula of sheep that are 3,500 years old that have portions of this sequence scratched on them. So the question, what are the rules which generate the King Wen sequence, is at least a question of mild interest to students of the archaic mind. So I began looking at this. And I want to compress this because I want to get to the more flashy, glitzy, and wow-inducing part. But we have this steep learning curve. Thus it ever is with intellectual revolutions. What the hell can you do about it, you know? I mean, it's not as bad as Newtonian physics. You'd have to learn the calculus to understand that. So you're lucky on that score. Anyway, what I looked at under the promptings of this inner voice was what mathematicians call the first order of difference. This is a very simple concept. It's how many lines change as you go from one hexagram to the next. As you may know, the first hexagram is the creative, 6 unbroken lines. The second hexagram is the receptive, 6 broken lines. Consequently, the first order of difference is 6. Comprende? No problem there. All right. So I charted the first order of difference. And what I got was what looked, well, let me say that a graph of the first order of difference could theoretically contain the following integer values: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. What we in fact discover when we carry out the operation is that there are no 5s. This is an artifact of human intentionality. This is not a natural property of the system. Someone made it be like that. And we discover other interesting artificialities, which I won't burden you with now, but it's all taken care of in the invisible landscape. But what we find that is most interesting is that if you look at this 64-point graph of the first order of difference in the King-Wen sequence, at first it looks random, but then you notice a very, very interesting anomaly, which is that if you copy this wave and then put it through the operation which mathematicians call rotating it 180 degrees within the plane, but which you and I would call turning it upside down. If you make a copy of the wave and turn it upside down, you discover that it slides together in a perfect fit at the beginning and at the end, and nowhere else. In other words, it is designed to be a natural module of hexagrams which are 64 running forward and 64 running backward. And when these two waves are placed side by side in this configuration of fit, the hexagrams that line up across from each other always add to 64. In other words, 63 and 1, 62 and 2, 61 and 3, so forth and so on. So it was this natural module that I was discovering. Okay, we're up and moving, but we're not there yet. An oracular system that has 64 hexagrams with 6 lines each in it will have 384 lines. And this number becomes very important, 384, the number of lines in a complete set of hexagrams. It has been known for a very long time that the lunar cycle was 29 point some days, a number such that when you multiply it times 13, you get 383.89. In other words, 384 is 13 lunations. And I began to think that the I Ching at this point was some kind of Neolithic calendar, that it was a simple repeating 13-count lunation calendar. In ancient Judea, there was a 384-day calendar. Hasidic Jews still, in some cases, use a 384-day calendar. So there is a tradition for this. It precesses against the solar year 19 days per year. So if you're a solar order freak, this kind of calendar drives you nuts. And I think there was some kind of struggle in prehistory between lunar calendars and solar calendars that was part of this suppression of the goddess thing. It was just one aspect of it, that these lunar calendars were traded in for solar calendars. Okay. 384 days is 13 lunations. When this number is taken and multiplied by other numbers in the I Ching, such as 6 and 64, you get other astronomical cycles. In other words, when you take 384 days times 64, you get 67 years, 104.25 days. That's 6 sunspot cycles of the minor type and 2 sunspot cycles of the major type. In other words, it assigns one sunspot cycle to each line in a kind of cosmic hexagram, and one major sunspot cycle to each trigram within that hexagram. When you take that duration, 67 years plus days times 64, you get a number, 4,306 years, which is 2 zodiacal signs, like the Aquarian age, that sort of thing. Those last about 2,200 years. So I thought, aha, what this thing is it's a resonance calendar that operates on several levels to keep track of lunations, sunspot cycles, and the precession of the equinoxes. Now, this is not inconceivable. In other words, you can see all these things with the naked eye. They have been observed since the Neolithic. And it would just mean that those ancient Chinese were sure clever folks, which is no news either. So it's like of mild interest that there are all these nested cycles. But then the series of ideas took a somewhat more radical tack. And it said, this can be used as a calendar, but that's not what it is. It's something far more profound than that. Take the little... Remember this module of 64 hexagrams running forward and backward against each other? It said, take that, which is like at the top of the I Ching hierarchy, because it's made of 2 complete sequences, and move it to the bottom of the hierarchy. This is a logical move traditionally allowed in Chinese philosophical thinking. Take the largest level of the hierarchy and move it to the bottom. Well, in the I Ching, the bottom of the hierarchy is a line. That's the seminal or atomic unit of the hexagram theory, the line. So I took this graph and I put 6 of them in a row, symbolizing the 6 lines of a hexagram. But a hexagram is more than 6 lines. A hexagram is also what are called 2 trigrams. These are 3-line structures that are embedded in there. And so I took my little structure and I blew it up by a factor of 3, and I laid 2 of those over the 6. Are you with me so far? Sort of, maybe. But a hexagram also has a unitary nature as a hexagram, a holistic nature as a thing in itself. So over the 6 and over the 2, I laid one large version of this backward and forward running wave. Now what I had at this point was a shitload of lines running all over the place, and a very concerned bunch of intimate acquaintances who were observing me with a rapidograph, no less, drawing these things in my room and emerging occasionally to announce that I had a map of the temporal continuum, because that's what this thing was assuring me was being revealed, that somehow this mishmash, this spaghetti of overcrossing and parallel and diverging lines on 3 levels was the Rosetta Stone to understanding process, history, so forth and so on. And that's where the whole thing seemed to come to an end. As I say, I was a concern to my friends, and Ralph Abraham, bless him, gave me very good advice. And he came to me and he said, no one can understand your wave except you. It requires you to interpret it. It's completely idiosyncratic. He said, what you must do if you want to be taken seriously is take your wave and reduce it to an ordinary mathematical object that other people can understand. And it was like telling a pig to fly, basically, because I hadn't the faintest notion how to operate in the language of mathematics or how to participate in a discourse at that level about this matter. And so there it rested for about 3 years. And then one afternoon, I was smoking cannabis in the confines of the library of the left wing of my large palatial home in the south of France. No, actually, no. I was getting loaded in my loft in Berkeley, and I saw the entire mathematical reduction of this wave. I intuitively understood how it could be done. And it was trivial. It was laughable. I myself, at the moment, laughed aloud. And I ran and I got paper and pen. And within 24 hours, I had the thing well on its way to becoming what I'm about to show you tonight. And you know, from 1975 on, we were programming this thing. The first program was written in Fortran, punched into cards, and ran on a CDC 6400 at Cal, which probably had approximately the power of an Apple Plus or something like that. In 77, we began writing programs for small computers, but there's nothing magical about the computer. What we have here is a rather complex mathematical object that the computer lets us explore without ever screwing up, without ever adding wrong or mislabeling or losing our calendrical navigation and so forth and so on. So the computer allows us, gives us eyes to see into a mathematical domain. And so then here's the notion. I mean, most of these concepts were covered earlier in the day, but now we're going to make them explicit. The notion is that time is not what we thought it was. That there are two aspects about the universe that are very important and that have been completely overlooked. One is the conservation of novelty. That the closer you get to this moment, the more novel the universe becomes. And this is the most novel moment to date. That's the first thing, the conservation of novelty. The other thing that's been overlooked is the acceleration of time. That time is not simply a steady state or a steadily accelerating phenomenon. It is an asymptotic and exponentially accelerating phenomenon. So now, with this introduction, we'll take a look at the wave. Those of you who have slept through this, or who have not understood a word I said, it doesn't matter at all, because you can just forget that and play this as though it were a game. Let me show you what I mean here. Always the acid test, the moment when we actually demand of the software that it do something. You don't have to be able to see the numbers to follow along, but you do have to just be able to see the graph, the graphic display. Now, what we're looking at is 6 billion years of time. And today is down here at the end, at the extreme, whichever direction that is. That extreme, that's where it is. Ah, right, thank you. A little dyslexic. And the notion is that what is being graphed on the screen is the ebb and flow of novelty over very large scales of time. These higher points are the least novel. This is a cosmology that says that there are two aspects of a single universal force, let's put it like that. And the two aspects are habit and novelty. And these two things are locked in struggle over vast scales of time, not infinity. Over vast scales of time, novelty wins. But it takes a long, long time. What the universe is doing is it is expelling disorder from the system. Now, notice this is scientific heresy. Science says what the universe is doing is spreading disorder, moving toward entropy, running down. But that physicalist model of the universe ignores the presence of biology. Well, now let's look at this for a moment. We are in orbit around a particularly stable, long, and slow-burning star that may exist for 9 or 10 billion years. However, the life of most stars in the universe is on the order of 800 million years. Life has been on this planet twice that long. Life is not some trivial tertiary epiphenomenon. Life is a process in this universe more tenacious and persistent than the stars themselves. And the physical proof of that is in the rocks of this planet. So a thermodynamic model of the universe that doesn't take account of the fact that life is spreading order is just bunk as far as I'm concerned. So what we're seeing here is what I've been talking about, the conservation of novelty over time. And delicately balanced chemical systems like organisms and conscious minds have many more degrees of freedom.
These linear scales or logarithmic scales?
No, this is a linear scale. So what we're seeing here is a prediction about the career of novelty. It's saying that we should dump our probabilistic picture of nature and we should substitute this fractal, which is going to make predictions about where novelty lies. Now, on a scale of 6 billion years, about the only prediction it's making is that there's more novelty in the domain around the present than there was in the extremely remote past. That is true. Do we all agree on that? That when we have electronic civilization, we have more than if we just have electron plasmas drifting in interstellar space. So the novelty is concentrated down here. Now, what we can do with the software, we can do many things with the software. I'm only going to demonstrate one function tonight, but the software is very versatile, and you shouldn't think that my clumsy use of it is the maximum of what it can do. But what we're going to do tonight is we're going to fly toward the present. We're going to produce a series of telescoping screens as we fly toward the present. And each screen is going to show us half as much time and twice as much detail. And the question you should be asking yourself as we look at these screens is something like this. This squirrely guy asserts that this is a picture of the career of novelty in time. Does it, in fact, fit my personal intuitions about where novelty rested? If you're a petroleum geologist, you will have data unavailable to other people. If you are a Renaissance philologist, you will have data unavailable to other people. If you're a historian of rock and roll, you'll have data unavailable to other people. In other words, take your area of expertise and measure it against the phenomenological description of novelty that the wave gives and see what you think. There's 6 billion years, there's 3 billion years. Now let me show you what we're seeing here. This is the plunge into eukaryotic life. This is approximately 1.7 billion years ago. The planetary surface stabilized one frame back, and this is a pretty straight picture of life's descent toward electronic civilization. But there were enormous crises in that. For one, the production of oxygen in the atmosphere of the early Earth that produced a reducing atmosphere, which was like a toxin. But what I want to do is look fairly briefly at these old, large scales and go into the domain of human history. I don't know if I said it in this weekend, but the holy grail of this theory is a predictive model of history that can be extrapolated into the future. You see, it's easy to predict the future because nobody can tell whether you're right or wrong. But when you predict the past, you really hang yourself out to dry because we know what happened in the past. So if you have a theory that predicts a certain thing going on in the past and it didn't happen, your theory needs a serious retread. And we have this, as we approach the present, our chronological database becomes richer and richer and richer. So as we fly toward the present, ask yourself if this is actually describing the ebb and flow of historical vicissitude. $3 billion years on the screen. 1.5, that's the whole career of organic life, 1.5 billion years. That's the last 750 million years. That is the career of organic life on the land of this planet. And as you see, at this scale, it's just almost a smooth curve toward novelty. I mean, all there is what mathematicians call oscillation around a mean. But it's almost a smooth swoop down into novelty. Of course, if you're an organism caught in some epoch somewhere in this vast sweep of time where there happens to be a little blip upward, to you it's hell itself. A glaciation, a cometary impact, a who knows what. But on this scale, it looks like a very, very straight and unstoppable approach toward ever more intense expressions of novelty. That's why I say the idea of deflecting or changing the historical momentum of what's going on this planet is inconceivable. This is the flight of the soul's path for the past 750 million years. So it has quite a momentum building behind it. If anyone has a question, feel free.
Are you equating the word novelty with the word order?
More like with the word complexity. Because order can be incredibly unnovel. In fact, I think order is somewhat opposed to novelty. Novelty requires a measure of chaos. Novelty is the perturbation to a higher state of complexification that occurs for apparently no reason. But of course, that apparently no reason rap is from a probabilistic point of view. This is the reason. This is the reason that the universe is complexifying itself over time, because the Aristotelian/Newtonian concept of time as a perfectly smooth surface is bogus. Time is not a perfectly smooth surface. It is an irregular fractal. And asking why it is this particular irregular fractal is probably like asking why is the charge of the electron what it is, or why is the speed of light what it is. It's because at the original symmetry breaks that occurred in the first few moments of the existence of the universe, these tiny flaws in the original assemblage have been magnified out to intergalactic scale. In a sense, the time wave is stochastic. It is random, but in another sense, it happens to be the random series of numbers which rules the ebb and flow of time in this universe at all levels.
On this, when you said where this data came from?
The data is the reduction of this three-leveled structure that comes out of the King-Wen sequence of the I Ching. Since you raised the point, let me address that. A lot of people allow themselves a pitying smile for this theory because they think that it's really quirky that someone would argue that a revolution in physics should take place based on a reanalysis of a 3,000-year-old occult Chinese text. I mean, that provokes mild amusement in some quarters. here's why they should take this seriously. The I Ching is a book about time. It is called the Book of Changes. Its specific and stated intent is to describe the ebb and flow of Tao. Now, we in the West took a certain path of development toward an obsession with matter and the exterior world. And the culmination of that obsession is, nuclear fusion or something like that. I mean, we got our chops together in terms of understanding matter. These ancient Central Asian people were as interested in time as we are in matter. And they had an entirely different set of techniques for exploring this entirely different domain. They journeyed inwardly into the quantum mechanical flux of organism itself. In other words, I think using drugs, breathing techniques, who knows what, that there were very early in Central Asia an adumbration of what are called stilling of the heart techniques. These are yogas that place great stress on suppressing gross physiological functioning, like breathing and that sort of thing. And when you do this, you sink into organism deeper and deeper and deeper in trance. And what you see is flux. You see the universal ground of circumstance. And they observed this, and they created, as good scientists must, a system of notation for what they observed. And they saw that flux is particulate, made of pieces, irreducible pieces. And they saw that the number of types was not infinite. They saw that the number of types was 64. And they created a kind of algebra, if you will, for noting these things and keeping track of them. It has always been remarked as an astonishing coincidence that the genetic code and the I Ching are exact structural mirror images of each other. It is no coincidence. It couldn't be any other way. The I Ching is a dynamic picture of organism. The DNA is a static way of picturing organism. Time is a phenomenon made by organisms. The irregularities, the fractal vicissitudes of the flowing medium of time are quantum mechanical discontinuities magnified to macrophysical dimensions by the kind of chemistry that we call living chemistry. The animal body is an amplifier for quantum mechanical indeterminacy, and it creates the phenomenon of time. And these ancient Chinese people understood this. And it's something where they answered a question that we can barely frame the question, let alone understand the answer. The question they answered was, what is the nature of being in time? And they found out, I think. And my approach to the I Ching is that it's a piece of smashed machinery. What we're doing here is like trying to rebuild a fossil animal or a chariot that has been squashed by the detritus of the ages. We're involved in noetic archaeology here. The I Ching was mysterious and old at the beginning of the Han Dynasty. They didn't know what it was. They inherited it from some high civilization that they looked back upon with awe. So part of the archaic revival that we haven't talked about is the recovery of noetic systems and folk sciences from vanished civilizations. Shamanism is the most spectacular example because we trip and it shapes our lives and we weep and exult. But the I Ching is another example. of an intellectual system for the description of a domain of nature that we've lost touch with. Now let me do this, and we'll look at some more. 750 million years on the screen, 375 million years on the screen, the career of higher life on the planet, 187, 93 million years on the screen. Now, this is interesting because we are now in a domain. What? Yes, every 8 levels, if you use an approach factor of 2, you pass through a whole number in the fractal. The pattern repeats, but the numerical valuation here is different. Every point in the wave has a unique Gödel number, a unique numerical value, but the pattern repeats over and over again at all levels. And isn't this in fact what time is like? Every day is sort of like every other day. Every year is sort of like every other year. And yet there come days and there come years when, you know, your jaw drops and you run for cover because you round the corner in the fractal. So it's this peculiar tension between habit and novelty, exactly as we're saying. Now, the reason I linger over this screen, we have 93 million years on up. It is known that in the last 100 million years, a staggeringly novel event occurred. And any theory of history that wishes to be taken seriously cannot fail to predict this event, because almost without reasonable contest, we can say with confidence where in the last 100 million years the most shattering symmetry break in the evolution of novelty occurred. It occurred one morning about 65 million years ago, when a planetesimal object struck this planet and in the course of a few minutes killed everything on this planet larger than a chicken. The dinosaurs, which had been in evolution for 170 million years, that was it, curtains for them. And the arguments against this event occurring have dwindled now to just carping and whining. I mean, we know, we have a picture of this event. We know that the, huh?
The impact trigger, they estimate the asteroid was 180 miles in diameter.
Right.
Off the Yucatan Peninsula.
It struck in the Gulf of Mexico off the Yucatan Peninsula. It was 20 miles deep into the planet in the first 3 seconds of the impact event. It raised a wall of Earth 45,000 feet high that moved out at 9 times the speed of sound. I mean, it was like splat on this planet. And it happened 65 million years ago. It happened right there. This descent here picks it up. To the degree that the date of the impact is known, and to the degree that this can be calibrated, if we take this point here as where the event occurred, then for all practical purposes, it's an absolute dead-on prediction. So this symmetry break is picked up. And of course, then we see life rebounding. You see, strangely enough, this enormous planet-crushing catastrophe was the greatest opportunity the mammalia ever had, because we were at the level of egg-stealing weasels when this event occurred, and there was no room to move to higher positions in the company. But once the impact had occurred, you know, the doorway was open for executive advancement, and our people, and by that I mean the prosimians and the lemurs and the whole rest of that insectivorous furry crowd, poured into those niches, and the mammalian radiation began. And also, higher plants. You know, this is something most people don't realize, that all flowering plants are less than 65 million years old. There were no flowering plants to speak of on this planet before that. So the mammals and the flowering plants emerged out of that planetesimal impact. In other words, the planet as we know it.
Just a little aside, that impact of an asteroid is estimated to be hundreds of times larger than every hydrogen bomb if all the nations of the Earth put together have in their possession.
Yes, I mean, it darkened the sky for 20 years. It killed everything on this planet larger than a chicken. All right, now let's go.
When you talk about, I thought novelty was getting more as you go down.
Yes, novelty is increasing.
So when you say now that the new species had a chance to proliferate, wouldn't that happen at the top there?
No, here what you're seeing pictured is a steady state of some sort, an equilibrium where everything is locked up.
And when it all of a sudden plunges, would that be the increase of novelty right away?
Yes.
So the impact should be on top, not on the bottom, right?
Well, one of the things that made it so difficult for the proponents of the impact theory to gain adherence in the early phase was the people who didn't believe in the impact said, "You're crazy. How can you claim that this happened in a single moment when what we see in the fossil record is that there had been a steady decline in the number of species for several million years preceding this catastrophic collapse of species?" I would now argue, and this may provoke small smiles, but I think that life actually sensed the impending impact and that there was a kind of a drawing back. I think we sense the equivalent of an impending impact. I think what we are, in fact, is a defense against cometary impact on this planet. We're like an immune response that the planet has raised against that kind of an event ever happening again. The problem is you have to give, computer targetable fusion missiles to be able to protect the planet. And in under the aegis of the wrong political agenda, that could get dicey.
I'd like to understand the graph, though. Is the plunge, the big plunge, wouldn't that be the increase in novelty?
Yes,
And
but the novelty is maximized down here.
Right, but the plunge itself is the... Oh, I see what you're saying.
You see? So novelty is increasing very, very rapidly, reaching its maxima here, slight bounce off, another plunge, maxima, bounce off, plunge, maxima.
So is the novelty, as it increases from the top down, is the top part when the catastrophe hit, and then the novelty starts right after that?
Yeah, I would read that the impact is right there. That's the symmetry break. Okay, now let's go into, and notice one of the, remember I think I said here that the interesting thing about making novelty such a central value is the way in which it then places value on us, because we are the quintessence of novelty. And this idea seeks to unify the inorganic, the organic, the biological, the social, and the psychological into one unified metaphor, yeah.
That the same pattern keeps repeating periodically as you narrow the scale more and more or magnify the screen more.